Hello everybody and welcome back to Spacedock. I'm SOJOURN and this week I finally got around to watching the Creator, which has these vehicles with Batman Tumbler-esque suspension systems with the wheels on the inside. They look pretty cool and got me thinking about all the weird and wonderful ways that sci-fi tends to spice up the humble car. We're going to start out nice and simple and grounded with airless tyres, a perennial feature of near-future sci-fi wheels and, well, near-future reality. They replace the cushioning effect of air with special shaping or different materials, or use flexible spokes to get a similar effect. In terms of practicality, they have their upsides, but a big one for sci-fi specifically is that they're usable in vacuum, or really anywhere. There's a double upside for vacuum use, as they can take more punishment than a puncturable tyre before needing to be changed, the process of which is going to be a bit more involved on the lunar surface than, say, the side of the road in some light drizzle. In fact, there's already been airless wheels up on the moon, though the Apollo rovers used a squishy metal mesh over a stronger internal frame to replicate a sort of tyre that was low weight, strong and flexible. Iterations of this sort of wheel have been made, focusing on improved elasticity, better materials and for use with heavier loads. These wheels are important for potential future rovers because solid ones, like those in use on Curiosity, are susceptible to damage, even with how slowly those rovers drive. I'd be interested to see more of these mesh wheels in sci-fi because they show up so very rarely, probably because they feel dated. That didn't stop Ad Astra though. They thought it was a smart idea to copy lunar rovers from the 70s for a setting in the 22nd century. Speaking of aging designs, look at all these older sci-fi cars. How odd do they look? The cars in the original Total Recall and Robocop and such look downright tacky by today's standards, though at least with Total Recall, those cars were meant to look tacky. They were cheap and cheerful things even then. It's just fun to peer into the time capsule that sci-fi is to see the ideas of the future but represented in the design language of the time. Things like covered wheel wells, which have been a real life thing now and then, or the ubiquitous self-driving pod cars that show up in sci-fi and real life. Similarly, there are things like asymmetry, which many cars in Cyberpunk 2077 exhibit some amount of, as are vehicles with greebly bits which aren't really a thing outside of off-roading because of aerodynamics. The exception is modified road-legal cars with self-driving equipment slapped onto the outside of them like LiDAR and camera rigs and such. Just like how sci-fi tanks often have wide tracks, sci-fi cars often have wide wheels. These are slightly less egregious than the tracks at least, since wide wheels are useful for getting power to the ground, since a bigger contact patch means more friction. They also improve braking for the same reason and are more stable. But bigger wheels require more oomph to get them going, so there's an efficiency trade-off. However, sci-fi wheels tend to verge on the flashy side rather than the sensible one because it just looks cool. Not all super big wheels are complete nonsense though. Red Faction Guerrilla is a good example because many of those vehicles are also off-roaders, where big wheels are far more useful. There's also an extra level of usefulness for big wheels here on Mars thanks to the low gravity, which makes it harder to get traction. This truck I want to call out specifically because it has extra wide, almost tube-like wheels, which seem like they're based on rollergons. These huge, low-pressure balloon tyres are designed for exceptionally soft terrain like snow, sand and mud, but their massive contact area with the ground also makes them perfect for increasing friction in low-gravity environments like Mars or the Moon. In a similar vibe are spherical wheels, which can allow for maneuvers that normal wheels cannot. They allow the vehicle to crab sideways, drive at angles, or to rotate on the spot. Sounds great, right? Well, it's not like this is something normal wheels can't do. The trade-off for ball wheels, beyond the engineering challenge of controlling something that has no physical connection, is just how gigantic spherical wheels have to be. All that extra mass on each wheel in exchange for lower contact area on the ground, or the ability to do things normal wheels can also do? They do look awesome though. This cool tech on display here with normal wheels is possible thanks to in-wheel motors. Think of the transaxle from the Aliens APC, but just applied to civilian vehicles instead. This is harder to spot when sci-fi uses it, but the telltale giveaway is having a hubcap that doesn't spin with the wheel. In-wheel motors have a lot of real-world benefits, like reducing space requirements within the chassis, but they're far from perfect. The biggest issue is that the motors are located before the suspension, so they take the hits, though there are variants that just move them to be near the wheels rather than inside them, but that's not quite the same as the cool sci-fi version, is it? These motors also need to be electric due to their small size, but they can at least be powered by an onboard generator of some kind rather than running on pure batteries. Which brings us to the myriad ways of powering sci-fi cars, which understandably is just ignored most of the time. Whatever it is, it's gotta be nice and energy dense to be worthwhile, something which has held back battery-powered vehicles in real life until relatively recently. It doesn't even need to be super futuristic either to be cool, like the cars in Cyberpunk 2077. They all run on Chew-2, a synthetic biofuel which was probably more futury back when the setting was originally created, but now seems rather mundane. It's not all bog-standard energy sources in sci-fi though. Now and then we get a fun joke about them running on garbage in a fusion blender, or they're atomic-powered and nonsensically explode like a nuke. So while we don't always know what things are fueled on, sometimes it can be inferred from the design of the vehicles, or some other feature of the setting. Like in Looper, most cars are old fossil fuel vehicles, but they've been modified to have pipes going from the exhaust to the fuel cap, and some have solar panels on. It's just a little touch to show there was some development that was backwards compatible with older cars, but not in a tidy way. Adds a lot to the world. Back to cars in general though, and the other big option is doing away with wheels for motion entirely and using Hovertech, which has all the same issues it would have on a sci-fi tank, which we already discussed in these videos here. Things like sliding around due to lack of friction, or using huge amounts of power when stationary just to stay aloft, stuff like that. There's no reason to have these downsides when regular wheels are perfectly functional. Want to go sideways? We've already shown that's doable. An interesting variant of the hovering car is one that requires a special road to hover on. These feel way more possible than a vehicle that can hover anywhere, because you can offload a lot of the problems into the permanent infrastructure. You can also do things like have cars stick to these roads, like in Minority Report, or the underslung ones seen in the Total Recall remake. However, the big downfall of these things is that they're really just worse trains if you think about it. So let's free them from the limitations of hovering close to the ground and let them fly free, as so much of what sci-fi allows them to do. What's cooler and more futuristic than a city with twinkling lights of traffic following very specific lines through the air for no readily apparent reason? Let's go full car brain by limiting what are essentially aircraft to roads, but in the air! Okay, I'm being a little bit unfair on what is a timeless trope. Flying cars get put into so much media because people can relate to them and because they're cool. Cars represent freedom, ones that fly more so. Everyone knows the issues they have with safety and all that, so I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole. Sometimes settings have cars on both the ground and in the air and treat the flying ones more like differently shaped helicopters that are much easier to drive. They're also used in the same way helicopters are used now, by corporations, the rich, or law enforcement, while everyone else schlubs around on the ground. This depiction of flying cars being a luxury item used by the top of society and those that enforce the status quo is exactly why cyberpunk as a genre uses it so much. Cyberpunk 2077 and Blade Runner also changed the styling and names of their flying cars to differentiate them from normal cars. Blade Runner has the wonderful and iconic spinners, which are different visually thanks to the two protruding elements at the front end, and that's despite many spinners still basically being cars. Cyberpunk, the brand, calls them aerodynes, and 2077 takes things a step further by making them look more like aircraft. Compare this luxury aerodyne to a luxury car from the same manufacturer. There's some similarities, but the flying one is still very different. No matter if the car soars through the skies or crawls along the ground on strange rubber feet, spicing them up is a really easy way to demonstrate the style of sci-fi a setting is going for. And since everyone is familiar with cars in real life, they provide an excellent route for easy world building without drawing too much attention away from the story or characters. You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our Spacefighter design reference book. Alternatively, you can support us directly through YouTube by giving us super thanks or by becoming a channel member. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.